Qabbalah is the received wisdom of the Jews. Qabbalah is a perpetual background meditation upon the hierarchical structure of consciousness. Why submit yourself to this meditation? In order to upgrade your operating system until it becomes the perfect reflection of the universal consciousness.
The Kabbalah is like the owner's manual of the human soul. And as no two people are alike, no two people operate their own soul alike. We've all got different things we have to learn. We're all at different stages of development and stuff. No, we've all got little different buttons that need to be pushed and stuff. The Kabbalah teaches us how to work with our own set of equipment. The whole idea of Kabbalistic thought is to achieve progressively higher levels of consciousness. When you do that, you get progressively healthier, you get progressively wiser, you get progressively funnier. You just start to turn into a real-life human being. You start to realize your potential. We've got all of the equipment inside of us, in our minds and in our nervous system, to achieve these levels of consciousness. But most of us are just very happy just to be stupid. It has been a carefully preserved and jealously guarded science. The reasons for doing that are varied and unique. Okay, maybe they wanted to keep the knowledge from the profane and such. I don't know what exactly was the reason for keeping it so secret and guarding it with such mystery. But the cat is out of the bag. The Kabbalistic cat is out of the bag now. In the last half of the 20th century, Kabbalah became a science of interest not only for Orthodox Jews, but also for Christians, atheists, people of all walks of life. Well, look at today. We've got Kabbalah centers. We've got Kabbalah books all over the place. We have movie stars. Women like Madonna are studying the Kabbalah. And in the old days, of course, women couldn't study the Kabbalah. You had to be a man. You had to be over 40. You had to be rich enough to afford the leisure time to study this stuff. Now it's seen as a legitimate Western mysticism. And I like to say Kabbalah is Western Eastern mysticism. Kabbalah is the Zen of the West because the goals are exactly the same. And that's spiritual enlightenment and a union with the Supreme Deity. The Kabbalist just goes about it a little bit different than the Eastern mystic. Eastern mystic gets real quiet and goes within and strips away all of these illusionary sensations and ego and all the things that we aren't until there's only just pure self left. And when that happens, bingo, something snaps inside. They go a little crazy in a socially acceptable way. And all of a sudden there's no difference between the perceiver and what they're perceiving. Okay, they just become wall to wall. They hit this emptiness. But it isn't emptiness. It's just wall to wallness. Okay, the Kabbalists do exactly the same thing. Or shoot for that same goal, only they don't strip stuff away. They draw connections between that thing and that thing and that thing and this thing and this thing and that thing. They connect everything in the universe because everything in the universe contains the pattern for everything else in the universe. Everything is the reflection of everything in the universe. And so the Kabbalists just start, well, that's connected to this by means of these correspondences, and there's Kabbalistic techniques, real life ways that you can play with the thought of your own daily life. It's a way of looking at things, and sooner or later you're going to get to the point of where you actually find your own place in the universe, and you'll have connected everything to everything else, and all of a sudden You snap, you go crazy in a socially acceptable way, only you've hit divine fullness. You've got that same wall-to-wallness, the same level of consciousness, supreme enlightenment that Eastern mystics shoot for.
Let's talk a little about Yod-He-Vav-He, the great four-letter name of the Hebrews. It's an ineffable name. You're not supposed to say it. Okay? So when pious Jews run across the word, even in print while they're reading the scripture, they say another word instead. They say Adonai, which means Lord. So when they see Yod-He-Vav-He together, you don't say it. But it's ineffable for another reason, because technically it's a formula, not an anthropomorphic deity that we're talking about. And it's a formula that breaks absolutely everything in the universe. All energy, all matter, all forces, all levels of consciousness into 4 sections. Okay. Yod-He-Vav-He is supposedly the one God. So, in a sense, there aren't 4 parts of anything. In a sense, in the ultimate sense, there's only one ultimate absolute thing. But it's represented in 4 sections, 4 descending sections, if you will. So Yod-He-Vav-He. The Kabbalists look at all the world as being broken up into 4 worlds that correspond to these 4 letters of this great name. And because we're made in the image of deity by tradition, our own souls are broken up into those same 4 categories, okay, that are just miniature reflections of that big 4-fold division of the universe. Okay. So we got 4 Kabbalistic worlds, 4 parts of the soul things. But let's just kind of look at these 4 Kabbalistic worlds first of all. The very top one is called Atzilith, and it's called the archetypal world. And that's really the real world, okay? The other 4 worlds under it are just sort of expressions of it. It's like looking at all those other worlds with darker and darker sunglasses, really. But the second world is called Braya, and it's called the creative world. The world underneath that is called Yetzirah, and that's called the formative world. And the lowest world is Asaya, which is the material world that we're living in. Okay? And one is just kind of a reflection, a lower reflection of the other, all the way up to Atzilith. Okay? To explain what these 4 worlds are about, I use an example of a chair. Let's say that all 4 of these worlds are a 4-story building, and that everything in the universe, all the forces, all the energy, all the consciousness of the universe is represented as this 4-story building. And we walk into the first floor and we see nothing but chairs. Chairs of every size and description. You got milking stools, and you got lazy boys, and you got couches, and you love seats, and every chair in the world is on that first floor. Well, there is a section of that floor for absolutely everything that manifests in the material world. There's a tin can section of that floor. There's a small vibrating appliance section of that floor. There's a duck section of that floor. Okay, but just for this example, we're in the chair section. So it looks like a Wix Furniture showroom of nothing but chairs. And we ask ourselves, where do these chairs come from? And we could say, well, the chairs come from wood and nails and upholstery and wool for the upholstery, but that's not true, because there's a wool section, there's an upholstery section, there's a nail section, and it's all on the first floor. So the chair itself as a entity didn't come from the first floor at all. It came from the next floor up. And so we get in an elevator and we go 1 floor up from the ground floor. An elevator door opens and we don't see any chairs here. but we see blueprints for chairs, like hanging from invisible wires all over the place. And there's no physical chairs, but there's these forms of chairs, because this is the formative world we're in, Yetzirah. Okay? And if we want to use the imagery of the Kabbalists, we actually see people walking around maybe in white lab coats, the people that drew these chairs. And they've got pens and pocket protectors and pens, and they're kind of nerdy kind of people, because all they do is draw designs for these chairs. So in Kabbalistic parlance, these are angels. They're nerd angels, okay, up there in Yetzirah. Okay? And it's their job to set the pattern for all of those chairs to eventually manifest on that first floor. Okay? Can you sort of see it going from the specific, to the general? Okay, where do these nerd angels get their orders? How do they know that they're supposed to be working on chairs? They get their marching orders from one floor up. So we get in an elevator again, we go one floor up, the elevator door opens, and we only see one angel behind a big desk. And this guy looks like Thomas Edison. He's the Thomas Edison of chairs. I don't know if you know, but Thomas Edison, who invented everything in the entire 20th century, it seems like, he would just get this idea in the morning. He'd get this very strange idea, and he'd scribble something down on an envelope or a piece of paper, just something you could hardly read. And he would call up like one of his nerd angels who worked for him, one of his engineers, and he would explain to them, this, how something makes a vibrating sound when you rub it, well, I want to make something that rubs on something else, and maybe run that impulse down this wire to that diaphragm that we stole from Alexander Graham Bell, and figure out a way to run it to another thing so it makes something wiggle and scratches another thing, and then rerun it back down another thing, and until it comes out this big cone. I mean, literally, he would make such broad, sweeping generalities, but he'll say, it's a phonograph, I need it in 2 weeks. And then that nerd angel who couldn't think of that big plan, okay, goes and takes that big plan, that inspiration, and goes ahead and builds a phonograph. And Edison gets it in 2 weeks, okay? Well, this is the Thomas Edison of chairs. And he might just be thinking something like, people are going to die if they can't sit down. People can't stand up all day long. Their feet will get real big. They'll pop. They'll fall down. He just has this idea of people needing rest. And that he has this general idea that they need to put their buttocks down to take the weight off of it, okay? That's all he says. I need a butt rester. And so he calls one of his nerd angels from downstairs and just says flat out, people gotta get off their feet, invent me butt resters. And then they in turn go, oh wow, I never thought of that idea of a butt rester. Oh, well, we can make millions of different kinds of butt resters. Okay, this Thomas Edison up there on the 3rd floor is an archangel. And an archangel represents huge titanic forces of nature. We could look at gravity as being the archangel, gravity AL. Okay, but he's got angels working for him on the lower floor who's like drop AL or plop AL or slide or drag or droop AL. You see different aspects of gravity. You follow me? Okay. So that is the Thomas Edison of chairs is up there in Braya, the creative world, the archangelic world of the Hebrew Kabbalists. So you got Braya, the creative world, then under that yet Zyra, the formative world of the blueprints, and finally the world that chairs itself. But we got one more floor, and it's the very top floor, and in reality, it's the only real floor. Okay? And that's Atzilith, and it's called you're looking at angels that designed it, an archangel that conceived it, and the abstract concept that inspired it. Those are the four Kabbalistic worlds. And they have an exact counterpart in our own souls. Each of us are running around as that 4-story building. Our bodies are the lower floor here, okay? And that's called the Nepish, or the animal soul. And we share that same part of our soul with all sentient beings. And it's the part of us that makes sure that it's the flight, make sure that we eat and have sex, but it's also a blind force, okay? It needs to be controlled by something. And in human beings, the first thing that needs to control that is your intellect. And that's the next part of our soul, okay? That corresponds to those nerd angels in the Kabbalistic world. And that world's called the Ruach, and that's the mind's eye. That's our intelligence. When Grandma knows exactly what the Thanksgiving dinner is going to look like and smell like, and where everybody's going to sit, she's already got all of that in mind before Thanksgiving. She's working on her Ruach. Most of us don't even think that there's anything but our Ruach. Okay, our Ruach has sort of like barricaded itself in our projection room, okay, and is trying to make us think about everything and try to understand everything with our intellect. It's sort of embarrassed about our Nepish, which is like a black sheep in the family you don't talk about. But even the higher things we try to explain to ourselves through this Ruach. Above the Ruach is a thing called the Neshama. And it's sort of an impossible word to translate, but it kind of means like soul intuition. And this is the level of consciousness in the part of our soul that, as mystics, we like to identify with. This is when a mother wakes up in the middle of the night and she knows that Johnny's in trouble. Johnny's just, I know Johnny's in trouble. It's been an accident or something. She wakes up. It doesn't even count as psychic phenomena anymore. We know it happens. It's a fact of life. Okay. Did Johnny sin? Mom Mom a message, like a telegraph through the aether, that she picked up and translated. Oh, Johnny's just telegraphing me psychically and tells me that he's in trouble. Nah, that's not the way it happens. Not only that, if Johnny would have been on the other side of the country when that happened, Mom would have picked it up just immediately. And if he'd have been on the moon, Johnny would have gotten that message to Mom, or Mom would have gotten the message. Okay? If Johnny would have been on Alpha Centauri, or a million light years away, she would have still got it. And that's because Mom's neshama, that part of her soul, is so big. It has no spatial limitations at all. No matter how far Johnny goes, he'll never get out of Mom's neshama. Same thing with you, your neshama and my neshama. We're all walking around, bumping around in each other's neshama. This is why a magician can see a spirit in a triangle. Literally see it, and it still be inside him. Because of the neshama, we may as well say there is no outside of ourselves. Because even the things outside of ourselves are within our neshama. And just above the neshama, that part of our soul that is the reflection of that highest Kabbalistic world, where the male and female aspects of Eden is a part of our soul which we may as well just call the life force itself. And that's our true identity. Just like the highest Kabbalistic world was the only real world, the highest part of our soul is called Chai, spelled C-H-I-H, almost like a chia pet. But it's Chai, like l'chaim, to life. That's our real identity. And that's where every mystic is shooting to be. Okay, we've seen how the Kabbalists have divided the spiritual world and the world of the human soul up into these four broad categories that correspond to the letters of the great name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. 4 is a fantastically big number. But we can also extend that to absolutely everything else and subdivide into 4 and subdivide the 4s and 4s and 4s and 4s, etc., to look at progressively more focused areas of creation. We could look at the 4 fundamental forces of physics: the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. We could put each one of those in the pigeonhole of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Same thing with the chemical elements of the fiery nitrogen, the watery hydrogen, the airy oxygen, and the very earthy carbon. And speaking of fire, air, earth, and water, the ancients also divided everything and applied that virtue of those elements to literally everything: fire, water, air, and earth. The Kabbalists, who view numbers as living things, just like scientists that would put a specimen under a microscope, Kabbalists put the number 4 under a microscope and thought about the number 4 by looking at its component parts. And one of the major ones they came out with was 4 is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. And all of a sudden equals 10. You put 4 under a microscope and you see 10. So obviously 10 is a huge, huge number in the Kabbalah. The 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Yod, that small single flame. That's the fundamental Hebrew letter, and if you would blow on that single flame, it creates all the other Hebrew letters. And that 10th letter, which has the numeration of 10, because of course in Hebrew the letters are also numbers, so Yod means 10. Look at this, we've got 10 fingers. We've got 10 fingers. Our hands, which, Yod means hand. Our hands are what separates us from the beasts. 10 is a huge, huge number in the Kabbalah. And when contemplating the universe, when contemplating their own souls, the Kabbalists looked for things occurring in nature. They looked for things occurring in logic that has the landmark of 10. And they came up with this incredibly wonderful schematic diagram called the Tree of Life. It's a schematic diagram of the mind of God. And by Kabbalistic logic, it's also a schematic diagram of our own souls. It's not the oldest diagram in the Kabbalah. It only goes back to around the 1500s. And while it's not completely satisfactory, you more or less can hang anything that you can possibly think of from matter, energy, consciousness, anything that you can think of. You can probably find a place on the Tree of Life to hang it. Now, it's that diagram that has 10 circles, and those circles are called Sephiroth, or emanations. The only real Sephirah is the first one, the top one. It's called Kether, it's called the crown, which makes sense. It's the singularity, it's the absolute, it's God beyond which there is no other God. It's God beyond which there is nothing. As a matter of fact, that one did come out of nothing. And the Kabbalists have a concept, a three-part concept of three kinds of nothing that the one came out of. Even language shows us how this happens. What's bigger than God? Well, nothing's bigger than God. Right. That nothing is a real thing. Okay. What's greater than one? What's more unified than one? What's more powerful than the absolute? Nothing. Right. It came out of nothing. And that nothing, according to the Qabbalah, is a three-part nothing. Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Or. Three inscrutable kinds of nothing out of which one came. Now, it's kind of hard in a setting like this to actually explain the concept of Ein Sof and Ein Sof Or. But the Kabbalists do a wonderful, beautiful job. And it gives the Kabbalistic mystic something to shoot for. Because the second to the last thing a Kabbalistic mystic needs to achieve is oneness. Complete identity with the one. That's the second to the last stage of Kabbalistic enlightenment. The very last thing is to identify completely with the nothing. Now, I know that sounds all mystical and everything else, and boy, it really is all mystical and everything else. But let's go back to how this Tree of Life developed. This Tree of Life developed to show us all of these things we have here. These stars, these planets, these galaxies, these worlds, these elements, these rocks, these things, this stuff. How did all this stuff come into being from that one? And the Tree of Life sort of shows us how to do that. The Tree of Life also shows us how to gather up all of our stuff and recline the Tree of Life to become the one, and then to realize the nothing. Okay, here's how it happened. Imagine that you were deity, that you were the one thing in the entire universe. There's nothing beyond you. You don't even know what you are. You can't hold a mirror up to your face and say, oh, that's what I am. There is no outside of you. You can't sit down because all the chairs are inside of you. You're just a big one, okay? How can the one become self-aware? How can the one even know what it is? Why it would want to know, I don't know. And neither do the Kabbalists. Neither do any of the mystics. What the motive was for the one to start to think about itself, but it did. And because it couldn't hold a mirror up to itself and look at itself in the face to see what it is, it had to do what the yogis now do, and that is to sit down very quietly and go into the center of oneself. And so the one did this, went into the center of oneself till it hit the very, very deepest, most inscrutable center of its oneness and reflected itself inward. And when it saw what its oneness was by finding its center, it realized, wow, that's what I am. You know, boy, I'm really big, or boy, I'm really small, whatever it is, it's the biggest or the smallest of anything in the universe. And it reflected itself, and then created the second condition. One, the crown, created the second condition, two. And in the Kabbalah, that Sephiroth is called Chokmah, or wisdom. But something happened at the exact second that two was created. The third condition was created, and they were born at the same time. Sorry, you just can't have a two without a three. It's one, the reflection. Oh, that's what I am, the one said. Okay, that's what I am. A third condition, the knowledge of the self and the not self, and the knowledge that there's a difference between the self and the reflection. Created a third condition, and that third condition on the tree of life is called Binah, or understanding, as if, oh, I understand that I'm not the reflection, kind of thing. All of this is very, very subtle, and no stuff is being created yet. It just shows us that one cannot even be thought about unless you think about three things. On the tree of life, 1, 2, and 3, Kether, Chokmah, and Binah are called the supernal triad. And in a sense, it's a reflection of the three kinds of nothing that preceded one. Okay, that's a trinity unit. A supernal triad, 1, 2, and 3, a trinity unit. It really is a way of saying this is what one is. This is the Holy Trinity of everybody's choice. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. It's the three in one. Well, that Trinity unit did the same thing that one did when it reflected into two. A second Trinity unit is reflected from that first Trinity unit, and it flips, creating the numbers 4, 5, and 6. And the same thing that happened when 3 was created out of 2. Same thing happens on the tree of life and with Trinity units, and a third triad is then replicated beneath that, creating 7, 8, and 9. It's very, very, very clean now. We've got 3 Trinity units going from 1 to 9. And the whole thing attempts to start over again, literally grunting itself, pinching its eyes to try to replicate that pureness of the one again. And number 10 was formed as a reflection of a reflection of a reflection of the one. And that number 10, Malkuth, the kingdom, is the material plane and human existence. The ancient Kabbalists projected upon the Sephiroth what they call planetary spheres. Now, they're not quite like the planets themselves, which the Hebrew alphabet takes care of quite nicely, thank you, but planetary spheres, as if the quality of the planet was what was being represented. All things martial, all things Jovian, all things solar. Now, the ancient Hermeticists, in a geocentric world view, saw the world being surrounded by planetary spheres, the spheres of the planets that enclose the world like layers of a glass onion. And there were 7 planets, including the sun and the moon.
Now, even though that we know this is not astrologically correct or astronomically correct, it is still hermetically correct because these 7 spheres represents all things of that quality. And on the number 1, there were no planets. Okay, that was too inscrutable. As a matter of fact, even number 2 was too inscrutable to assign a planet to, and they assigned the sphere of the fixed stars to. Number 3, however, even though it was still the supernal triad, still above this inscrutable abyss that separates the supernal triad, the ideal, from the rest of the tree, the actual. Number 3, they assigned to Saturn. And Saturn wasn't a god. Saturn was a titan. And Saturn ate his children. And as long as Saturn ate his children, there was no creation. There was no evolution. But once he was tricked with a stone, his wife tricked him and gave him a stone instead of baby Jupiter or baby Jove. The tail came out of the mouth and number 4 was created. And who is in number 4? The god Jupiter, the creator god, the demiurgos. And Jove is just a couple letters off from Jehovah. Okay, both the so-called creator gods. Well, from our point of view, that's about as high as we can see, is this creator god. But they order the universe. And all of the other brothers and sisters that were eaten before Jove, they also were thrown up after this event. And they all came out of Saturn, and they all plopped their way down the tree of life in order. Mars for number 5. Sol for number 6, Venus for number 7, Mercury for number 8, Luna for number 9. And number 10 is the Earth itself, almost created as an afterthought of creation. These planetary spheres become very important to Kabbalists once they start their ascent back up the tree of life. Kabbalistic tradition informs us that in the beginning, the Creator created heaven and earth. And the Creator did so by speaking it into stretched itself infinitely and created infinite height. And in doing so, it sealed an infinity of height. And if we can imagine that ceiling, is if I would reach up and touch the ceiling here, and it would create concentric rings going eternally out. So that was infinite height. And then it turned below and stretched itself and reached infinite depth and sealed the infinite depth, just like if I'd reached down and touched the floor. So now we have one thing, a very, very skinny, very, very lanky universe. Certainly not enough universe to put anything in. So it reached to infinite rightness and sealed infinite rightness, just like if I would seal this wall over here. And it reached to infinite leftness and touched and sealed the infinite leftness, just like if I touched this wall. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, we've got length, okay, and width. Okay, it's a very flat universe. We can't really create very many things yet because there's no depth yet. So to do that, deity extended from that central point until it sealed infinite frontness and extended backwards and sealed infinite backness. And what we have is up, down, right, left, forward, and backwards. Now we have the potentiality for space and time. And look at the landmarks that created this infinitely expanding space. 3 mothers. Up, down, right, left, and front and back are attributed to the 3 mother letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And look what we've created with all of those intersecting infinities, top and bottom, right and left, forward and backwards. We create an infinitely expanding cube. And with the deity as the center and the 6 faces of this cube expanding infinitely, we have the 7 double letters of the Hebrew alphabet. When we look at that cube, we see that there are 12 edges, 12 landmarks of that cube. 3, 7, and 12 created the universe. Games Kabbalists play. Why do Kabbalists play games with numbers and letters and words and phrases? Why do they do this? They do this to occupy their brains, to occupy themselves long enough to get out of their own way and gain enlightenment. Games Kabbalists play aren't the end. They're the means to an end. And as a matter of fact, don't even think about the end when you play Kabbalistic games. They're just certain kinds of ways to occupy the myths of Kabbalistic history. There was a Kabbalistic university where people were more or less encouraged to just think about these things.
And so they got a little tired of 26, so somebody said, okay, you guys, let's look hard at Yod He Vav He and see if we can put it under a microscope and see if we can come up with new numbers, new things that will tell us even more about the details of the nature of deity. And so some smart student came up with the idea, well, let's put it in a little triangle. Let's put Yod, then Yod He on the next line, and then Yod He Vav, and then on the next line Yod He Vav He. So it's Yod, Yod He, Yod He Vav, Yod He Vav He, Ragmap. That's the old song there. Then when they did that, they added the total of the letters, and they came up with this number 72. Now 72 is kind of an interesting number because it represents, to an astrologer anyway, 72 periods of 5 degrees that more or less pinpoint with 72 letters each. Now this was impressive and probably impressed their teachers a great deal. But it might not have been so impressive if the verses that these 72 letters appeared in were probably the most recognizable, most memorable books in the entire, or verses in the entire Old Testament. Now, who could forget Charlton Heston standing up on a rock, separating the waters of the Red Sea so the children of Israel can pass through safely while the Egyptians get drowned? That's what's talked about in those 3 verses. Remember, he goes, behold his mighty hand. Okay, and that's almost like saying, behold some Kabbalistic knowledge in these 2 things, okay, or these 3 things. And so what they did was they wrote those 3 verses like a snake. Okay, they wrote the first verse with 72 letters, as is done in Hebrew from right to left. Then the second verse of these 3 verses, they wrote right underneath, going from left to right, and then the last verse from right to left again, and then they looked at these letters in 72 columns and read the 72-fold name of God. Pretty impressive, okay? So instead of saying Yod He Vav He, which they don't say Yod He Vav He, the 72-fold name of God would be pronounced, well, you'd have to really take a real big breath in order to actually say that. But each one of those, okay, then they allotted that. They allotted each of those sections, okay, to 5 degrees of the zodiac. Hey, not only that, but there's 72-fold names of God. But if they added an IH or an AL to the end of those 3 letters, they created an angel of the Shemhamfurish, that is the executor of that particular facet of Yod He Vav He that rules days of the year.
It's so beautiful. No, not only that, but you see it wonderfully exhibited in the structure of the tarot, where the 36 small cards, the 2s through 9s of each of the 4 suits, are laid out perfectly along the lines of the angels of the Shemhamferish. And those, of course, represent the 4 Kabbalistic worlds that descend. Okay, you can get it all the way down to the demons of the Goetia, the day and night spirits of the Solomonic magic. The reason I'm even going through all of this is to show you how one thing leads to another, is connected to another. You can dissect things down into madness. Wonderful madness. And somewhere along the line, on these games that Kabbalists play, your Ruach, remember the intellect, finally gets overloaded. And it just sort of gives up and sees the connection of everything in the universe, everything in heaven and earth, connected to everything else in heaven and earth. And in the afterglow, in the ecstasy of that realization that looking at one thing is in absolute essence looking at everything else, and that it's all connected, is the Kabbalistic illumination. Now that we've seen how the Tree of Life is constructed and how the invisible has become visible down here in the world of 10, now that we know that it is our mystical duty, our personal spiritual duty, to climb back up the Tree of Life and eventually gain union with Godhead, how do we go about that? The Kabbalah has many techniques and a wealth of traditional literature that symbolically give us hints on how this is done. But the simplest way to explain it is to look at a tree of life, just like you've drawn here, and to turn it into a Kabbalistic fairy tale. A fairy tale that is very, very familiar to all of us. But let's say that in this fairy tale we have a king, a queen, a prince, and a princess. And the king is Yod, the queen is Hey, the prince is Vav, and the princess is the Hey final. Us, we're the princess. But the king lives right here. And if we would put it on the Tree of Life here, let's say the king lives in number 2. Because the king had to come from somewhere too. So let's just say the king is number 2. And his queen is number 3. Okay. When the king and queen get together and make love, their ecstasy annihilates their separate personalities and they become one. That's But how do we get in on that act? Let's go back to the Tree of Life here. So there's the King Yod, Queen Hey. Now, when the king and queen make love, she becomes pregnant with twins, a prince and a princess, and they both plop out below the abyss. The prince, however, plops out a little higher than the princess. The prince's kingdom, or the principality, is Sephiroth 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. But he sets up his headquarters really in number 6. That's really the core of who the prince is. And the princess, finally, poor princess, Hey Final, is down here in number 10, where we live. The princess has amnesia. She doesn't even remember that she has a brother, a prince, or that they're both the children of a queen and a king. As a matter of fact, the princess is totally oblivious. She thinks she's caught up in an endless loop
of karmic soap operas, not knowing that there is a wonderful, wonderful spiritual heritage just above her. If she could only meet the prince, and if the prince could only kiss her, something wonderful would happen. You know, the prince over here, living in Vav here, it's pretty high and everything else, but you know, he'll never be king unless he takes a bride, and that bride is us. So, in the spiritual fairy tale of the Kabbalah, each of us has a prince. We call it the holy guardian angel. It's a terrible term, but it's as close as we can possibly get to actually describing what it is. It is our self perfected, but it's even more than that. It's a spiritual entity that we have to mate with. It's the goal, it's the lover of every ecstatic mystic that ever walked the face of the earth. He's Christ to the Christians, he's Krishna to the Hindus. Ultimately, he's us. But until he kisses us, like we're a sleeping beauty, until he smashes that casket of matter that we're trapped in and presses those mad lips to ours, and we realize we wake up. Until then, we're still stuck in this prison of matter. So the first job in our path of return is to have the prince kiss us. Not only that, but once the prince awakens us and we kind of know who we are and what our birthright is, the prince makes love to us and we become pregnant.